Tough tone from President Biden last week. Tough agenda in D.C. and internationally as well. Does his tough rhetoric and his sort of lean to the left in that respect make his job easier or harder to execute on his agenda?
Well, among Democrats, and certainly trying to get his public approval rating among the party base that voted for him, this is the campaign Joe Biden. This is the Democrats have been chomping at the bit. They've wanted him to go tough. They've wanted him to go after Trump. They've wanted him to get feistier. And he's been reluctant because he's been trying to pass a legislative agenda. Now he's passed a few really important things, infrastructure in particular, some COVID relief early on, certainly gotten vaccinations off the ground. We've run into a big bump with this new variant of COVID, but nonetheless, he's accomplished some things. Now they want to see him engage the Republicans in terms of rhetoric and mobilize their own base going into November 2022. And that speech last Thursday was a pretty good start if you want to see that campaign version of Joe Biden again.
Okay, so what does that do in terms of the Democrats? Does it unite them, Wendy?
Well, it certainly tries. But, in the end of the day, the progressives in the House in particular have to make a decision. Are they willing to sacrifice 2022, lose control of the House, but gain more of influence within their own Democratic Party? That's their choice. The Republicans have done this. The Tea Party to the Freedom Caucus and the Trump wing, they have taken over the party, at least in the House and somewhat in the Senate. That's what the progressives are looking at as a landscape. And they want these programs. They want what they want. And if they can't get it with this version of the Democratic Party, they're going to do whatever they can to remake it so that they can get it in the future. That's very risky. But on the other hand, if you really believe these are the policy goals and this is the future of the party, and this is the only way to mobilize the key constituencies, then you're going to go forward with it. So it's a very difficult terrain for Biden to manage in his own party, much less dealing with the GOP. And by the way, in terms of foreign intervention, a very small appetite for intervention among the American public right now.
So to that point, Wendy, University of Chicago did some research on the anniversary of January 6th and showed that over half of the 700 people who broke into the Capitol have been arrested so far were business owners, CEOs from white-collar occupations, doctors, lawyers, architects, accountants. And that fact was staggering because that's not the overwhelming opinion that you tend to get. And I'm wondering if the shift to the more progressive and harsher rhetoric is going to alienate those individuals that still believe that the election was stolen. Those are not a fringe population.
No, and these are two really important, slightly separate points. One is that we've always sort of thought of this suburban or upper middle class wing of the Republican Party as less extreme and more likely to sort of take facts and be less avid for Trump. And what we've seen is that isn't happening, that in fact, at least among men and suburban voters who are men, they are turning even more towards Trump and this wing of the party. And that's something that's new for the Republicans and new for our political dynamics. So that's of a pretty big concern, I think, for the establishment Republicans as well as the Democrats, particularly going into the Senate races in November 2022. And the second thing is, that's a risk you take. Do you just, continue to try to win back those voters? Or do you decide that mobilizing your own base, particularly at the state level, particularly in light of some voter suppression laws that are being passed around the country, is that more essential for the Democratic Party's success in the elections themselves in November? It's a gamble. And it looks like right now, given the president's turn to voting rights, Martin Luther King Day coming up, that the president's willing to take the gamble.
Wendy, can I just come back to a point you made earlier about interventions? Around 10 minutes ago, the talks between the United States and Russia in Geneva concluded. There is clearly an appetite to take action in Washington if Russia were to go into Ukraine in a more forceful way. We don't know exactly what that could look like, but were we to see some sort of an invasion, there certainly seems to be language coming out of D.C. that suggests that there will be a significant response. That response will not involve boots on the ground. What do you think the Biden administration would be looking at? How tough do you think it would get? And how do you think that would play domestically in terms of U.S. politics running into the midterms?
Well, I think the option is probably harsher sanctions, particularly economic sanctions. But of course, that hurts Europe. And if that hurts Europe and the European economies, then that probably impacts, you'll know better than I, the stock market. And so Americans will get sort of indirectly harmed by any economic fallout from tougher Russia sanctions. And Russia's still a trigger between Republicans and Democrats because Republicans feel that Trump was unfairly smeared by this Russia connection and the Russian investigation. So it's very, very sensitive territory. And I think Biden's got to balance, being an international player after withdrawing from Afghanistan. And I think most people agree that didn't go well. And explaining to the American people why we're bothering to get involved at all when we've got a COVID pandemic that won't subside. We've got inflation. We've got, healthcare worker shortages. And
Yep.
I think this is something Democrats have got to figure out. You have a too big agenda. People turn off and they tune out. You've got to focus that agenda and make sure that agenda relates directly to their daily
Yep.
lives.